I'm excited to be here tonight. We're going to get to start a new chapter in the book of Acts. We finally finished, or completed, I guess, chapter 5. And we're moving on to chapter 6. We're going to give Peter a break for a little bit. He's been doing most of the talking, right? We have, in the past 5 chapters, heard a few sermons from Peter. But now we're going to be introduced to some new characters and see what their role was in the first century, and also see the importance of their lives and their dedication to the ministry. Now, I'm not taking anything away from Acts, the first 5 chapters, right? I've enjoyed them. I've learned a lot from those chapters. A lot about the culture, a lot about the judicial system of the Sanhedrin, the feast days, the gifts of the Spirit, and the mighty acts of Yahweh in the early days of the Apostolic era. It's been great. I've grew tremendously just in my understanding of all those things, and I grow like that because I have to study, to teach. It's funny that if you'll just take the time and put it in there, you tend to learn something, you know. But I'm excited to gain ground in the book of Acts and see how the disciples of the apostles exercise their faith in their daily lives. After all, are we not the disciples of the apostles as well? Amen. Sure we are. Sure we are. So that's what we're going to do today. In the last lesson in Acts chapter 5, we finally saw the culmination of what would happen to the apostles if they continued to speak and preach and teach the name of Yeshua. We've seen that. We watched as they were warned in Acts chapter 4 not to teach or to preach in the name, and they did it anyway, right? Even to the point that they were arrested in Acts chapter 5. They were sent to jail, but only to be released to go back to the temple and do it again, teach again. So then we saw them brought in for questioning a second time, and they got flogged on account of it, right? They got their lashings. But even after this, they were released, and they walked out of there rejoicing and continuing to teach, not only in the temple, but also in people's homes, to share the gospel and the truth about this life, the life of Yeshua. These men have definitely been resilient up until this point, I would say. Nobody has lost their lives, but they have definitely been persecuted for faith. That goes unsaid. Now, at the end of chapter 5, it seems that maybe Gamaliel has bought them some time. The wise counsel of this Pharisee seems to have at least spared their lives and gotten the Sanhedrin off their backs for a short while anyway. Remember, Gamaliel advised the Sanhedrin to leave them alone. He told them that the teaching that they were preaching was of men, that it would be overthrown. But if it was of the Almighty, then there's nothing that they could do. They couldn't overthrow it anyway, and they'd find themselves fighting against Yahweh. So that seems to have done the trick and gotten the leaders off the apostles' back for a little while, at least. And so just keep that in mind as we start through Acts chapter 6. Keep the context in the back of your mind. That's our backdrop leading into this, and we'll go ahead and read Acts chapter 6, verses 1 through 7. Starting in verse 1, it says, "In those days, as the number of the disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint by the Hellenistic Jews against the Hebraic Jews that their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution. Then the 12 summoned the whole company of the disciples and said, 'It would not be right for us to give up preaching about the Almighty to wait on tables. Therefore, brothers, select from among you 7 men of good reputation, full of the Spirit and wisdom, whom we can appoint to this duty. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the preaching ministry.' The proposal pleased the whole company, and so they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and the Holy Spirit, and Philip, and Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, and Nicholas, a proselyte from Antioch. They had them stand before the apostles, who prayed and laid their hands on them. And so the preaching about the Almighty flourished. The number of the disciples in Jerusalem multiplied greatly, and a large group of priests became obedient to the faith." Now this text seems somewhat different than what we've seen in the last 5 chapters, I would think. Or at least it does to me. We still got 12 apostles here, but we have a couple of new groups introduced to the apostles' story. We see 2 different groups of Jews mentioned, or so it seems. And then we have 7 distinct disciples mentioned by name later on in verse 5. Now we're going to uncover who these people are and what their role is as we go along. But for today, we need to get started where every good Bible student gets started, and that's in verse 1, right? We're going to start at the beginning. And so again, verse 1 says, "In those days, as the number of the disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint by the Hellenistic Jews against the Hebraic Jews that their widows were being overlooked in their daily distribution." Now, I could probably teach a whole sermon series on this one verse. It would be real easy to do, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do my best to lay it out as simply as possible while still helping us gain the understanding that we need to move on through the book of Acts. And I want to explain the difference between the Hellenistic and the Hebraic Jews, okay? But before we get into that, I want to first point out, first and foremost, the attention given to widows, as it is a top priority of Yahweh's. It is a big deal. Not only is it today, but it was as well in those days, as verse 1 obviously points out. The reference to those days is a time frame mentioned by Luke as he records the life and the acts of Yahweh through the apostles. When he is writing some years later, this great book that we call Acts, to Theophilus, right? You remember? So when verse 1 starts out and Luke says, "in those days," he's talking about the early days of the apostolic community. He's reaching back, okay? The apostolic era takes a little while. Luke writes this some years later, and when he says "in those days," he's talking about at the beginning of the apostolic era. And if you'll recall, in those days, we've just been talking about this, the Jerusalem community of disciples lived collectively. They practiced communal living. We've been talking about that in Acts chapter 4, right? They shared in a common fund and contributed their belongings and earnings to one purse, so to speak, from which everyone lived. This common fund provided for the destitute and the impoverished people among the community. And the 12 apostles managed the fund, and they distributed the resources as needed throughout the community of disciples. All those people are considered the disciples. The apostles are heading this thing up. Now, in those days, the congregation of disciples kept a special list. And it was a list of registered widows and orphans that lived among the disciples. And those on the list were entitled to daily provisions from the community fund. Think about the life of a widow in first century Jerusalem. Think about what it would have been like. They obviously stood at an economical disadvantage, right? There were no career opportunities for widows. Women were homemakers, but a widow didn't have a husband to provide the needs to even make a home. And the typical widow may have also had several children to feed, and without an income or a public assistance, she was pretty much left destitute in a bad place. Remember, the children without a father were considered orphans, okay? Even if they had a mother, they were still considered orphans because the provider of the home was missing, all right? So the Bible constantly entreats us to take care of the widows and the orphans. It always does that. All throughout the Torah, all throughout the Tanakh, we see the constant reminder not to forget the widows and the orphans. As a matter of fact, James tells us in chapter 1 and verse 27 that if we want to know what pure, undefiled religion before Yahweh is to look after the orphans and the widows in their time of distress. And that's not just found in the book of James. We see it all throughout the New Testament. We see the communities established by the ministry of Paul. We see it in those communities. We see over and over again how he instructs the communities to care for the widows. He always tells them to do that. And in 1 Timothy chapter 5, Paul mentions the widow's list, and he gives some instructions on how he thinks that list should be governed. Paul didn't think that a young woman should be permanently put on a widow's list. Right. But older women of good rapport could be or should be. Right? So you can check that out in your own study time. But my point is this. The widows were to be attended to. Mm-hmm. That's what's supposed to take place. Yahweh is the champion of the widow and the orphan. And it was a noble act of charity to care for the needy, and so the apostles did just that in their community. The 12 apostles would distribute to these women and these children what they needed to survive, and in turn, the women served as disciples of Yeshua and servants to the way. Remember, their movement and the followers were called the way. So this was an honorable thing to do in those days, but at some point in the first few years of the Jerusalem community, the Greek-speaking Jews brought a complaint to the apostles. They alleged that the Greek-speaking widows were not receiving their fair allotment from the daily distribution. They were basically complaining that the Hebrew-speaking Jews were discriminating against them. All right? Now that may seem a little bit vague for you, or vague to you rather, but let me explain. The first century Jewish world was divided into two groups, okay? In this context, two groups, all right? They were distinct groups divided on a linguistic and cultural line. And here in Acts chapter 6, in verse 1, we see the division. And that may be a little bit misleading. I don't think that Luke's trying to be misleading when he writes this, but it's not entirely descriptive, okay? And if you don't understand the historical backdrop behind this, you may not understand it at all. And so I want to be sure that I explain the difference and where the division comes from. See, the Hellenistic Jews were Jews, just like the Hebraic Jews were. And both of these groups were still Hebrews, okay? I want to be sure that you understand that these are not converted Gentiles. The conversion of Gentiles has not taken place yet. We don't see this until Acts chapter 10. These are not converted Gentiles here. These are two different groups of Hebrew people. One group, the Hellenistic Jews, spoke Greek. And the other group, the Hebraic Jews, spoke Aramaic. Both of which are essentially Jewish and they are Hebrew, okay? Anybody from Abraham is Hebrew, right? Let me give you a little background on both of these groups, and I think that you'll see where the confusion might come from, and maybe I can clear it up. In verse 1, we see that Luke refers to one of the groups of widows as Hellenistic. Now that word is not found in any manuscript prior to the book of Acts, and so Luke is using this word to define the widows who speak Greek. In this context, at least. Again, not converted Gentiles, all right? In the broader sense of the term, it would refer to the Jew who spoke Greek and were acquainted with Greek culture or Greek customs. Now, some of these Hellenists would have lived in the diaspora, or some may have even lived in the land of Israel. See, almost every major city in Rome or within the Roman Empire would have contained a Jewish population. You have to think about how Rome became a superpower. Rome became a superpower because it took over land, right? And it grew and it grew and it grew. But these people that it conquers, they don't necessarily move out. They maintain who they are. They just live under Roman power. They're living under the Roman rule. And that's exactly what's happened with all of Israel and Jerusalem and Judea and things like that. And some of these small populations of Jewish people would have spoken Greek and would have moved around comfortably within the Greco-Roman culture. Okay, they have learned the Greek language. You're around somebody long enough, it's kind of like Hispanics. We're English speaking primarily here in the United States, but if you get down around Texas, everybody down there speaks Spanish, or most of them do. It's because the culture is intermingled and it's easy to understand, right? So they would have moved around comfortably in this Greek-Roman culture. Now you may think because of the word Hellenist that these people were Greeks who converted into Judaism, but that is not the case. That is not the case here. You may also think that these Hellenists were the liberals within the Jewish faith. Many scholars have actually assumed that for years, but that's really not true either. That's not true either. These Hellenists were just devout Torah students and temple worshipers who happened to speak Greek, at least here, right here in Acts chapter 6 and verse 1. We have no reason based on the context that we have here to think that the Hellenistic Jewish widows were any less devoted to the Torah than the Hebrew or the Aramaic speaking widows. We have no context to build that understanding on. See, the Greek speaking Jewish community was filled with a large diversity of people with varying affiliations and loyalties. A Hellenistic Jew could have been affiliated with the pagan Gentiles and then adopted a pagan culture like Herod Agrippa did. Okay? That was possible. It could certainly go down like that, but a Hellenistic Jew could have been very Torah observant, like Saul of Tarsus was. He spoke Greek, very fluent in Greek culture. He understood all of it. He was also very fluent in the Hebrew culture, right? Do you see what I'm getting at? A Hellenistic Jew was actually better equipped to bridge the gap between the two worlds, like Paul did, because he could speak both Greek, and he understood various cultures, so he could reach all, I guess. Philo is another big example here. Matthew mentioned the other night in his sermon. Philo was a Hellenistic Jew, and he attempted to merge the Greek philosophical traditions with the Jewish theology in Alexandria, Egypt. Now, others like Philo looked toward the large and prosperous community in Alexandria as their cultural, political, and financial center. All right? There was a huge synagogue in the city where the powerful Jewish community met, and so it was thriving with Torah-obedient, Greek-speaking Jews. But while that existed, and it was good for those who lived in Egypt or close by, they still made the pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem for the feast, and also they submitted to the rulings of the Sanhedrin, which was in Jerusalem. Okay? These Hellenistic Jews used what we know, or what we call today, the Septuagint. Yeah. That was their Bible. That was the Hebrew Bible, or that was their Greek Bible of the Hebrew text. They considered it accurate and authoritative, just as authoritative as the Hebrew. Okay? They attended Greek-speaking synagogues. They heard the Torah read in Greek. They prayed in Greek, and they taught in Greek. And look, they didn't have to go to Egypt to do this either. Even in Jerusalem, the large synagogue of the freedmen, which is mentioned in Acts chapter 6 and verse 9, if we'd have just kept reading a couple more verses, you would see the freedmen synagogue mentioned right there. It offered a home to the Greek-speaking Jews where they could worship and study in Greek right there in Jerusalem. They didn't have to go to Alexandria, Egypt to get that, all right? And listen, the entire Greek New Testament came to us through hands of devout Greek-speaking Jews. Yeah. That's how we got it, all right? So let's not look at the Hellenists as pagans or some liberals who infiltrated the Hebrew faith. I think that is the common mindset of especially people like us. Wow. We look at stuff like that. Any kind of paganist influence or something like that, we blame it on the Greeks and then the Hellenist influence. And it could be the case. But here in Acts chapter 6 and verse 1, these are widows who speak the Greek language and they're Torah observant. They are the disciples of the apostles. They're doing what the apostles teach, okay? They were Torah observant Jews, but they were just acquainted with the Greek culture and they spoke in the Greek language. I think that's what we need to keep in mind. Now, most of the sources that I've checked say that a vast majority of the Jewish people in the first century were bilingual anyway. Yeah. Bilingual in both Hebrew or Aramaic, or Hebrew and Greek, or Aramaic and Greek, okay? So that's who the Hellenists are. But what about the Hebraic Jews? Who are they exactly? Luke seems to contrast the Greek-speaking Hellenistic Jews against another group called the Hebraic Jews. Now remember, all descendants that came from Abraham are Hebrew, right? So I think Luke uses the term to indicate language and culture, not ethnicity. The Hebrews in this case are those who spoke Hebrew and or Aramaic as opposed to Greek. This is not to say that these people don't understand or know the Greek language. I'm simply saying for the most part they spoke in the Hebrew or the Aramaic language. And it appears as though the Aramaic-speaking community of people tended to look down upon those who spoke Greek and participated in the Greek culture. Now, the Hebraic Jews lived primarily in cities like Babylon or Syria, Galilee, Perea, Judea, Idumea, places like that. And these communities made up what was known as the Hebraic Jews. And they considered themselves to be the faithful remnant that was untainted by compromise. They hadn't fallen into the Greek influence, okay? See, a lot of the Jews in general were leaning toward the common Hellenistic views. Maybe they might have what we would call a cosmopolitan attitude, okay? Just kind of get along to go along, that kind of stuff. But the Hebraic Jews, in contrast, they maintained a more traditional separatist stance. They resisted the encroachment of the Greco-Roman culture. For example, the Hebraic Jews avoided Greek entertainment. They considered the games, the circuses, the theater to be idolatry. And by all rights, a lot of it was. A lot of it was. So unlike Philo, who tried to marry the Greek and the Hebrew cultures, the Hebraic Jews kept their distance and forbade the study of Greek literature and thought. They were trying to protect their traditions. But as history records it, even though there were many revolts against the Greek culture and against the Romans, the Hebrew and the Greek cultures did eventually merge pretty much. And shortly after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the Roman defeat of Judea, the Alexandria community faced a similar devastation. It wasn't just Jerusalem in 70 AD. And so the distinction between the Hellenistic Jew and the Hebraic Jews began to fade when all that happened. And so by the 3rd century, the Greek language had surpassed the Hebrew and the Aramaic languages in the land of Israel, and it became the common language, or the lingua franca. Now that's a little history lesson for us, but keep in mind the apostles lived before this, okay? Before this all happened, before this merge took place. And so what we see here in Acts chapter 6 is a strong division between two parties, all right? There's a sharp distinction between the two, and for that reason there has arisen a small problem in the apostolic community, at least as it pertains to the daily distributions for the widows. Now, knowing all of the history that I just told you, we should be able to see a couple things. First and foremost, I want to repeat that these are all Jews, or at least proselytes into the Jewish faith, okay? These are not Gentiles at all. They are all Torah practicing, obedient Jews. And the second thing that I want you to see is that they're having a dispute over what seems to be a lack of supplements distributed due to segregation between the two parties. That's what it looks like to me. It seems to me that the Greek-speaking Jews were being shorted their rations because they were a little bit different than the Aramaic-speaking Jews. So what's to be done? Well, let's look at verse 2. Verse 2 says, "Then the 12 summoned the whole company of the disciples and said, 'It would not be right for us to give up preaching about the Almighty to wait on tables.'" That sounds a little crass, doesn't it? The apostles are removing themselves from the responsibility of the daily distribution. Why? Well, as the appointed witnesses of Yeshua, their obligation is not necessarily to feed the community. Their obligation is to pass on the Master's teaching, right? But I certainly don't believe that they're shirking the task either. And neither do I think that they believe that they're too good to serve or to wait on other people. Number one, they've been doing this job the whole time, right? We read this in Acts chapter 5 and how everybody brought their proceeds and they laid them at the apostles' feet, and the apostles would distribute them as they seen need. So they've been doing this. They've already done this. They established a communal fund within the community, and they have managed it up until this time. But number two, the reason I don't think that they're shirking the task and they don't think that they're too good to serve is because they were commanded by their master in Luke chapter 22, verse 26 through 27 to do just this. I'll read the verses to you. This is Yeshua speaking. He says, "But it must not be like that among you. On the contrary, whoever is greatest among you must become like the youngest, and whoever leads like the one serving. For who is greater, the one at the table or the one serving? Isn't it the one at the table? But I'm among you as the one who serves." In other words, the one who is greatest is the one who serves. Yeshua's disciples were not greater than he was, yet he served them. So the apostles are not too good to serve. And neither should any man be who is a leader in an assembly or a shepherd over a flock of Yahweh's sheep think that they're too good to serve. I threw that one in there for free. It's a job of a preacher or a leader to serve. It's our reasonable service, like Brother Jerry says. It's just our reasonable service. Right. These famous preachers and televangelists today think that they're too good to serve. Come on, brother. But the Messiah said that the greatest one is the one who serves, not the one that has 10 million people following him, right, but the one who serves. Anyway, the apostles were not too good to serve, but sometimes some things are more important than feeding sheep physical food. Sometimes spiritual food is far more important, right? After all, isn't that why we fast? Yeah. We starve our physical man so that the spiritual man might rise up and overtake the flesh, right? So the spiritual necessity is far greater than the physical, and the apostles know this. Yeah. They know this. But there is a common fund, And there are physical needs, and those things must be tended to as well. Like the Messiah told the Pharisees, you do all these things great, the little things, but you forget the weightier matters of the law. You shouldn't neglect the little things to take care of the big things, but you shouldn't neglect the big things to take care of the little things. Spiritual food is necessary. Physical food is necessary. Spiritual food in this case is much greater than physical food. And so these wise apostles, they take a lesson from Moses. And like Moses, they call the community together and they tell them to select men to help serve. Now we'll see that in verse 3, but before we get there, I want to point out a couple more things in verses 1 and 2. Do you see the words daily distribution in verse 1? At least that's how it reads in HCSB. It says daily distribution. That is the Greek word diakonio. If I'm saying that right, I don't speak Greek, but diakonio. And it means serve. Yeah. It means serve. Yeah. And if we read this literally, it would read like this. The widows were being overlooked by their servants. Okay? Or in their servants. Now the same word is used in verse 2 where you see the word wait. And if we read it with the word serve in its place, it would read like this. It would not be right for us to give up preaching about the Almighty to serve tables. Do you see how that works? Okay, the word serve is translated from the Greek word diakonio, but this is also the verbal form of the Greek word for deacon, which is diakonos, if I'm saying that right, diakonos. So basically, what we see here is the 12 apostles decided to appoint deacons to help serve the community. You see? Remember, the community had grown to thousands, and there had to be great needs amongst the entire community. I can only imagine. So it was necessary for them to find some help to take care of the things that someone else could help with, while they devoted themselves to prayer and to the preaching ministry. That was their job. Yeshua commissioned them to do that. Okay? That's verses 3 and 4, and we'll get to those the next time I teach, and also learn more about the selection of the men that were chosen. But before we close out today, I want you to notice the example that the apostles followed when they decided to choose some men to help them. Does the selection remind you of anything in particular? Having to select men to help out?
Exodus, right?
Yeah, remember back Exodus chapter 18, when Moses was judging all the cases that the Israelites would bring him. He was doing it all by himself, and he was having a tough time because the burden was more than he could bear, right? Well, as you remember, his father-in-law, Jethro, he sits him down and he says, you're going to wear yourself out. You can't do it. You need to find you some help. You need to get some help in here. You're going to wear out. You can't tote all this burden by yourself. And so Moses takes the counsel. He does exactly what his father-in-law tells him to do. And so he selects 70 men from the community. He sets them in charge in groups of thousands, in groups of hundreds, 50s, and 10s. You guys remember all that? And basically the men Moses selected to help him are what you might call the first Sanhedrin, or the original Sanhedrin. That's where the 70 come forth from for the Sanhedrin. So Moses gets some help in the matter of judgment, so he no longer has to listen to every little complaint, but instead the leaders would hear most of the cases. They would dissolve a lot of it, but the ones that were too tough or too difficult, they would bring to Moses, and Moses would make a final judgment on it. And boy, it took the stress off of Moses. It was a pretty good plan. It helped Moses out. He got some sleep so he could continue on to the promised land and get those people up and get them moving in the morning, you know. So it was a good thing. But about a year into their journey, I think the Bible says in the second month in the second year, about a year into their journey, somewhere around Paran, the Israelites got a little tired of eating manna that they didn't have to grow. They didn't have to buy, and they didn't have to cook, and they didn't have to cultivate the ground to get it. And they started to complain to Moses again. Well, by then Moses has had enough, and he just wants to die. He's tired of being in charge of these stiff-necked, ungrateful Israelites, and he says, they're too much for me. They're too much for me. I can't take it. If you're going to treat me like this, Yahweh, please kill me right now. That's what he tells him. In other words, he says, I've had it. Just shoot me, Yahweh. I don't want any more of it. Well, what does Yahweh tell Moses? He says, bring me the 70 men of Israel known to you as elders. And I will put some of the spirit that I put on you on them. I will help them to bear your burden so that you don't have to bear it by yourself. Brothers and sisters, the apostles took the guidebook that we call the Torah today, and they applied it right here. They applied it. They did the exact same thing that Yahweh instructed Moses to do. Guys, it is not easy to nurture and care for an entire group of people, especially thousands and thousands of people, right? These apostles are just 12 men, and at this point, they're trying to teach and lead and feed and manage communal funds and keep everybody fed and making sure all this stuff is going right. And they're just 12 men. They're just 12 men. And so they make a move for some help, and rightly so. I think it's a beautiful way that they follow in the footsteps of Moses when they need help. So we're going to get more into this help that they sought after the next time that I teach. We're going to see who they selected, what their qualifications were to be selected, and how this afforded the apostles to be able to continue the ministry that they were charged with, to continue to do and teach what the Messiah did and taught. So until then, take the time to go back and read the example of Moses in Exodus chapter 18 and also Numbers chapter 11. That was a divided help I put there. So that when you get back into Acts chapter 6, you'll kind of understand. I'll give you a little bit of a tidbit of what's going on. I think it's really neat that they're arguing over food in Numbers chapter 11. And in Acts chapter 6 right here, they're arguing over food too. We're not getting fed. We're not getting what we want. Same thing was happening in Numbers chapter 11 right before Moses said, hey, feed these people. Feed them. I can't take them anymore. They're driving me nuts. And so anyway, keep reading Acts chapter 6, and I'll try my best to explain it to you and teach it to you next time that I get to speak. Yahweh willing.